Um, you mentioned Tony Blair before. I think this is when I met with Daryl Dexter. He said that Tony Blair said that when he felt most confident was in his third term, and that's when he felt most at peace as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I think that's what he said. And just to go back to that, I think it's really smart. And yeah, it's just. But now, my other question is, what have you learned the most from these people from all around the world that you've worked with?
Good question. First, I'm glad you talked to Daryl. I ran Daryl's very first election campaign when he ran for municipal office in Dartmouth, and I think it was 1996, if I remember right. And he won a seat on council by just a handful of votes. And I was president of the NDP Youth Wing in Nova Scotia at that point, and our team helped Daryl out. So in terms of what I learned was really that fundamental lesson around every place that I've been to, regular people want pretty much the same thing. And there are a couple of exceptions to that. I've worked in places like Afghanistan and some other spots where there are more people who've fallen prey to extremism of different sorts. And there you will get regular people who will say that, I'm not, they don't answer, what are you looking, you ask them, what are they looking forward to, rather than saying my kid's graduating from high school and getting a promotion. I've had people say that I'm looking forward to dying as a martyr for Allah. Okay, well, that's great, I guess. And I've had other folks from other religious and political backgrounds who also talked about the desire basically to die for their beliefs, and which is always a problem because most people aren't ready to die for democracy, because when we think about democracy, it's like, well, I'm not going to go and put my life on the line for slightly lower or higher interest tax rates. But if you're excited about the vision of communism, or the swastika, or things that get people excited and get your emotions engaged, it's one of the reasons that extremism is appealing. So I noticed that extremism is always appealing, that there's a reason that almost certainly symbols of the Nazi party from 100 years ago, that you took another political party from 100 years ago and hardly anyone around the world would know them. Why do we know those ones? Because they were incredibly powerful and connected to a movement that did something. And that tends to trick people into thinking action and bright colors tend to make people think that there's something real happening and something good happening. And that is realizing how that was a universal human weakness was one of the most important things I've learned in politics, because it makes you realize how extremism can happen anywhere. And one of the things that makes you most vulnerable to extremist movements is the belief that you are invulnerable, which makes sense, right? Like if you think about being infected by a disease, if you're convinced that you can't get COVID and go into a room full of COVID people, you're probably going to get COVID. People who are convinced they can't to be manipulated by misinformation, who then spend their time being exposed to it, are more likely to be influenced by it because they're not developing any mental sort of immune system to push back against the misinformation. So that's, I think, the tendency towards bright lights, shiny color, and shiny things is a huge weakness that human beings have that is universal. But equally, the other lesson is that what people really would like is kind of the life that we get to enjoy a lot of the time in a province like New Brunswick, where I always use the example of a friend of mine. He's got a 10-year-old daughter. He's a pilot friend. He's got a little open-seat airplane. Wouldn't have cost more than a second-hand motorbike. And he and his daughter go out, and they go flying, and they land in a farmer's field. No one cares. The farmer doesn't care. The government doesn't care. He's respectful. He and his daughter go and look around in the woods and pick up things in the fields. And they're just living this private life of exploration and adventure. And everyone in the world wants that. And we are so lucky to have it and have no idea how precious a gift it is. The fact that you and I could happily talk about which coffee shop we might want to meet up with on this call, not worry about the government listening in, and then go and meet up for coffee, talk about whatever we want, go about our day. We don't get how unusual that is, and how, using China as an example, you've now got multiple CCTV cameras for every single citizen there. And people are just living a life of surveillance, self-censorship, and direct government control. And I've lived in countries like that, and they suck. They just crush your soul So the more that we can fight to have quiet Saturdays like we've got today, where we can just wander around and do whatever meaningless, kind of nice little thing that we feel like doing, we've got no idea what an incredible gift that is. That is more than equal to the importance of building cathedrals and spaceships and other things. That freedom to have a quiet space in life is an enormous gift. And I want to try and talk about that in politics, because if we don't talk about it and realize what we've got, we risk losing it. And that would be an incredible loss, to not just for us who would miss out on those experiences, but next generations who would never know what it was like.
Yeah. New Brunswick is definitely the best place on earth, I'd say. One of, at least. But yeah, we are absolutely lucky to be here. I was born here. You were born in the United Kingdom, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
So that was a shock to me when I learned that on your Wikipedia page. I think it says born in the United Kingdom. But how different has every place been that you've worked, like Bangladesh, Afghanistan that you just mentioned, here? If you've ever worked in, I know you worked with Jimmy Carter too. Not in the U.S., if I'm not mistaken. You didn't work in the U.S., but you worked.
No, I worked with President Carter in Bangladesh and in Nepal.
Yeah, so like all of those places and all of the different people, how has that shaped your beliefs?
Well, I think seeing the difference between places made me think a lot about why those places are different, because the superficial things are kind of obvious. If we go from here to Cuba, we can see that it's warmer. Yeah, and we see things that we tend to, as humans, notice the most obvious things first. It's why humans are prone to racism. It's easier to see skin color than it is to find out whether someone agrees with you on stuff. So we use skin color as a way of judging people. It's stupid, but we're just animals, right? Sometimes I think we apply standards to ourselves that aren't necessarily justified. We're just particularly clever monkeys, which means that we just have to work to try and push back against those more primitive behaviors when they pop up. So what I notice is that really the temperature, skin color folks who live there doesn't really matter. What matters are the institutions. That when you walk out your door, when you walk out your gate, is there a wall around your house and then there's squalor and poverty outside? Or is there a fairly decent road that you can walk on to walk to a school or a hospital or a store? Is there stuff in the store? Those kind of basic questions around what exists in people's lives. And that's all that really matters, right? The difference between here and Afghanistan is that in Afghanistan, stuff doesn't work. And that's partly because you have active groups of people in politics trying to destroy the things that worked. It's not that the people in Afghanistan didn't want schools for their kids, didn't want to have those opportunities. It's that there are people in politics who were pushing against those things in the form of the Taliban. So realizing that institutions are what matters, and then that there are people who build or destroy institutions, or the big group in the middle that we don't talk enough about, the people who just sit and watch as institutions collapse, who are the ones that make me really angry. That would be my big takeaway. So a good example there is Afghanistan. So I was there a few times from right after 9/11 until 2006-07. And I saw the people who, as we were chatting, want to have education for their daughters. Now that's totally denied in Afghanistan. Wanted to have a health clinic built up in their village. Just wanted the regular stuff you would expect any normal group of people to want. But a government that our country helped to put in place and that ran Afghanistan for nearly 2 decades were incompetent, corrupt idiots. And rather than standing up to those folks, we just said, oh, well, that's kind of the best they can do. And we allowed people who were supposed to be on the side of democracy become multimillionaires and steal from their incredibly impoverished country. And then when the Taliban reorganized themselves, they didn't even have enough spine to stand up and defend themselves in the country that had given them all this wealth over the last 2 decades. So that group of people in the middle are the ones that have always scared me. Extremists are a permanent feature of human life, by definition, right? You're going to have, anytime you have a moderate position, there's going to be people who are crazy off on left, crazy off on right side. It's the people who run institutions who don't protect them that make me really frustrated. And that sort of links back to why I think my party has got a role to play, that I don't see the Liberals understanding, as we talked about, that China is an existential threat to Canada, that the US is run by an amateur autocrat right now and is going through a crazy period, but China is the professional version. This is a country that has figured out how to repress people on a scale that no human society has ever been organized before. You know, the level of surveillance they have and control over citizens every day, it's absolutely terrifying. So people in the center, broadly like Mr. Carney, who don't seem to be aware of the risks they're taking by making deals that make sense today, just like the folks who I worked with in Afghanistan from the donor side, when they dealt with the corrupt Afghan government officials, they could justify it by saying, well, we'll let it slide that they stole this $5 million because we really need to run this program because that's going to help people. And at some points, you've got to be able to say, you know what? No, stop, back up, and start defending the core principles. And in Afghanistan, that core principle was, if we can't clearly show that the Democrats who are now running the government are better than the Taliban, then why would anyone continue to support the Democrats? And in our country, if we're going to talk about, using the China example again, and our own experience with First Nations here, we're going to talk about what we did in terms of cultural genocide and what happened to First Nations on Canadian territory, and talk about how terrible that is, because we did it, but then excuse another country that is currently doing something vastly worse on a vastly larger scale today, and say that, oh, well, they're now going to be our value trading partner, and that who are we to judge what's right and wrong? We need to start judging right and wrong again. And I think that's going to be that's another lesson that I took from my international travels, is that moral relativism that we've sunk into in the West over the last few years of saying that all ideas are equal, nonsense. It is not equal to say that all government officials should be elected by the people, and someone else to say that no, having a hereditary monarchy is acceptable. Those are not equally acceptable moral values. One is better, and I would argue it's better because in the places where that's been put in place, the standards of living for regular people have gone up. Life expectancy has gone up. Literacy rates have gone up. So I think we've got to start being a lot clearer about judging what is and isn't a good thing, and pushing for more good things, fewer bad things, and being a lot more blunt and honest about the difference. And that's going to, I think, might help us survive the next few years, because crazy people have no problem telling us what's right and wrong. Right? I'm sure you got folks like that you deal with at school who people on the extremes.
Absolutely.
Being an extremist is easy, right? Because I'm just, what do you think? What do you think about anything? You open up your little red book or your little brown book, depending whether you're left or right, and you just read the lines, and no thinking required. Being in the middle, navigating complexity, navigating diversity, making decisions about right and wrong, that's a lot harder. But that's also where human progress happens, and having lived in places that are really developed and really undeveloped, that progress, that development is worth fighting for.